Hey everybody, what's going on? Hexlex here, got another Master Duel video for you. So today we're going to be doing yet another one of our tier lists here. And now I haven't done one of these. I think the last time I did one was a little bit after Sprite release. So we've definitely had more than one major release since then. We had the Rikas come out, and then we also, of course, had the Ishizu support recently come out, which is hugely shaken up the meta. This is actually going to be one of those tier lists where, to be totally honest with you all, I'm at this point in time, like, this is like one of the least certain I guess I've been on a tier list, just because this meta is in a very interesting state, right? Where the Ishizu cards have, along with the sprites actually just before it too, both, decks had just one wave of support come out that in turn not only make them valid threats, but also hugely boost a lot of other decks as well. Sprites, of course, boosting anything that's got level 2 monsters in it, and then the Ishizu cards boosting anything that cares about the graveyard. So there's a lot of experimentation in particular going on right now, so it's really hard to place like exactly where everything is at power level wise, which I think is cool. I really like unsolved metas. I know a lot of people are not super up on this meta. A lot of people just don't like the Ishizu cards, and that's fair, that's valid. I, on the other hand, as I've said many times, and as I'm sure you can tell through all the Ishizu-based decks I've been uploading, I love pile decks. I love these 60-card mill decks. I think they're really cool. I think it's neat that we get to use these cards in a way that neither the TCG or OCG got to, and I think that's really what Master Duel, I don't know if that's what it's all about, but a lot of people, it seems like, really want Master Duel to either be an exact mirror of the TCG or OCG. I disagree. I think it's really cool that Master Duel is its own thing, and I think this format is a really good example of how you can have a lot of room for experimentation within Master Duel specifically. So, with all that said, let's go ahead and start ranking these decks here. We've got 30 to go through, so I'm not going to waste any more time. We're going to start with Adamancipator. Now, for a lot of these decks that use like other engines predominantly, it's kind of hard to tell just because it's so small, but I did put the engine in the little corner here. So here I have Adamancipator with the Ishizu engine. And this deck, I mean, you all know how I feel about this deck. I think this deck is up here in tier 1. As far as how much it's going to get played and how it's going to compare to other decks when it's, part of the whole, like, meta pool, so to speak, this is probably just in tier 2, I'll be totally honest. This is definitely a case where I'm very much having to fight my own subjectiveness and bias, because, again, I want to put Adamancipator up here. I think Adamancipator is tier 1 easy, but we don't have the stats just yet to indicate that, so I'm going to put Adamancipator in tier 2. And I think that Adamancipator will end up being like towards the top of tier 2, but not for its power level. I think just because there's so many different Ishizu variants that a lot of people who would be inclined to play a deck like Ishizu Adamancipator are going to be torn between all these variants. And so this deck is going to have less representation. I think that's actually going to be true pretty much across the board for Ishizu decks, is that they're going to have less representation than they should. Their representation, rather, won't meet their power level because people who like this are split between so many different decks. So, here represented by Yugioh is, this isn't for pure Ishizu, this is more for Ishizu pile decks, right? So think like Ishizu Chaos, the Necroface Mills, the just piles of like random good engines and stuff. Just pile decks in general, which is really the epitome of what I love about formats like this. I love jamming like just 40, or I guess in this case 60 good cards. Like 60 good cards, that deck is one of my favorite decks to play. So as far as these decks' strength, I think they're in tier 3. I'm going to put them at the top. I mean, it's the only thing in tier 3 for now, but I'd put these towards the top of tier 3. They're not as consistent as more focused Ishizu decks like Adamancipator or Dragon Link, because they're split between so many different engines and wanting to do a lot of different things, but that doesn't mean that they're bad by any means. It just means that they're less focused and in turn a little bit less consistent in my experience. Okay, next up we have Branded Despia. So, of all of the, I want to call them like old meta decks. I mean, Branded Despia is not an old meta deck by any means. It was just like, when I say old, I guess I'm referring to like pre-Sprite, right? So, Branded Despia, of all those pre-Sprite tier 1 decks, seems to be the one that more people are sticking with. I'm guessing the reason for this is because I think it's a combination of things, right? Because, like, I think Mathmech is still stronger than Branded Despia right now. Whoops, I did not mean to put Branded Despia all the way over there. But I think Branded Despia is seeing more play because it's more future-proof. And what I mean by that is that Branded Despia is a deck that is good now and will stay good for the foreseeable future. It can be used with tier elements, not to as great effect as tier elements with like a Shizu, for example, but can still be used with tier elements, can be used with Bestials coming out after those. And we also know that the branded support is going to get, branded support is going to get more very good cards, very relevant cards in the future as well. So Branded Despia, absolutely still a tier 2 powerhouse. You could maybe argue it's above Adamancipator. I, of course, think Adamancipator is a little bit above Branded Despia, but it's close. And indeed, I do think that Branded Despia, like I said, will remain a tier 2 force. I think it's going to stay, like, Branded Despia will definitely bounce somewhere between tier 2 and 3 for, like, at least the next 6 to 8 months, I think. If you're looking for a deck that is safe to invest in, or you're looking to really learn a deck that you already have that is going to be good in the future, I would definitely say Branded Despia is a very solid pick. Alright, here we have Marinesis, which I have not seen this card at all, I think, since I last rated it on a tier list here. Marinesis indeed seems to be one of those decks that has kind of fallen off a bit. It was in Rogue before, and it's going to stay in Rogue. It's probably going to be a little bit lower among the Rogue decks now. It's just one of those decks that, like, it's just kind of struggling to keep up with the power level. You know, I said this back when Sprites first came out, that moving forward, we're going to see a significant and noticeable boost in cards and decks' overall power level. And that Sprite decks are going to be kind of the new baseline for what Yu-Gi-Oh! Power level was going to be moving forward. And unfortunately, Marinesis cannot quite 100% keep up with that. Alright, next we have Adagnister, which is another deck that's kind of like fallen by the wayside a bit. I think what hurt Adagnister more than anything else was a lot of decks really started, particularly the Sprite decks, because they can make IP so easily. Underworld Goddess of the Closed World started seeing a huge boost in popularity. Same with Mech Knight Crusadia Avermax. Both, you know, again, like I said, mostly due to Sprite and due to the prevalence of IP Masquerena in this meta, and that really hurts Adagnister. Obviously, Adagnister is very much, you know, dependent on having their 6k towers in Arrival Cyberse be uncontested, but more and more we're seeing decks very regularly able to contest the 6k Arrival Cyberse. So, Adagnister, I'm pretty sure I either had it tier 3 or upper Rogue before. It's definitely going to be in Rogue now. It's just going to be a little bit lower. This is one of those decks where, like, I don't know if it was even a power level thing, the shift in the meta. It was really more a shift of what cards got, like, started seeing more and more play that caused the Adagnister deck to kind of fall down a little bit here. Alright, so after that we have Sword Soul Tenyi. This is another one of those old, quote-unquote, breed pure pre-Sprite tier 1 decks. This one is definitely decidedly still tier 2, but I don't know, I definitely feel like every day Sword Soul Tenyi just becomes less and less impressive, which is sad, I think, because I do like Sword Soul Tenyi, and it's obviously an extremely good deck. It's just, you know, less and less people, it's not just that less and less people are using it either, it's again the whole power level thing, right? Like, Sword Soul Tenyi, I think, is the prime epitome of the power level pre-Sprite, right? Like, Sword Soul Tenyi was, I feel like, very much the baseline. If your deck could compete with and tangle with Sword Soul Tenyi and come out at least 50-50 in games, then it was a contender in the meta. But again, it just is not as impressive when you see stuff like the Sprite cards and the Ishizu stuff, and then look to the future and see like tier laments and Bestials. It's like, yeah, it's sad. Sword Soul Tenyi just unfortunately can't keep up. Still not a bad deck by any means, but like, I wouldn't be surprised if, you know, this started getting put in tier 3 in the near future. It's just going to keep falling, unfortunately. Unlike Branded Despia, Sword Soul Tenyi does not look like it has any significant future support that's going to really push it back into the limelight. So, it's sad, but it's the reality of Yu-Gi-Oh!, you know. Alright, next up we have Mathmech, as represented by Circular. I mentioned this before. I personally think Mathmech right now is a little bit stronger than Branded Despia, but Branded Despia I'm going to place a little bit higher because it's just seeing more play. Again, I suspect that's because you know, you have TCG players who are playing Branded Despia now, maybe also playing it in Master Duel, or OCG. I mean, Branded Despia is still a fine deck in both metas, and will continue to be a fine deck in Master Duel as well. Same with Mathmech. Circular is interesting, the card itself, because that one card is about on par with the power level I've been mentioning with Sprite, Ishizus, and stuff moving forward. And it really lifts up the whole rest of the archetype as a result. I think, like Sword Soul Tinny, this is a deck that could probably, and probably will fall down to like tier 3 as more stuff is released, but again, if you've got it already, you can still definitely use it in this meta, and it's still very much a very good deck. I feel the need to like say this because a lot of people ask me, you know, and especially when I make tier lists, but when I play any given deck, I think, you know, about 50% of the time I'll see a comment somewhere that's like, can this deck hit Diamond 1? There are a lot of decks that can hit Diamond 1. Every single deck on this tier list can hit Diamond 1, and a lot of decks that are not on this tier list can also hit Diamond 1. Can this deck hit Diamond 1 is really not the right question to ask. It's more like, how long will it take to hit Diamond 1 with this deck? For example, you know, a Sprite deck can hit Diamond 1, and a Toon deck can also hit Diamond 1. It's going to take the Toon player a lot longer to get to Diamond 1 than the Sprite player, even if the Toon player is like, you know, a very seasoned and very good Toon player. And indeed, the lower on the tier list you go, the more dependent on the pilot it's going to be. To be fair, decks don't pilot themselves, and player skill is always going to be more of an important factor than a deck's power level. That said, you know, deck's power level then affects how long it takes you. It can also act as a bit of a surrogate for skill if the deck is indeed strong enough. Alright, so next up we have Thunder Dragons. Thunder Dragons have been a staying force in Master Duel pretty much since its release, and even if you look at MCS, very recent MCSs, you'll see Thunder Dragon continues to get relatively consistent tops. It's one of those decks where, actually, as I just mentioned, you know, it's one of those decks that might be rogue tier, but with skilled pilots can very easily tangle with even other tier 1 decks. Thunder Dragon, like I said, I will put in rogue, but I'm definitely going to put it in upper rogue. You could even make an argument for this being tier 3, but again, I think a lot of the success it sees is because of dedicated pilots, more so than the deck's inherent power level. So I'm going to keep it at the top, or at the very least upper rogue. Alright, next up we have Dark Magician. This deck has of course seen a huge boost in play thanks to the recent release of Illusion of Chaos. Also making the deck more accessible is the new structure deck as well. So Dark Magician, yeah, we've been seeing quite a bit more of those, but this is a case where, like, yes, the deck got a huge piece of very powerful support in the form of Illusion of Chaos, but it wasn't enough, I don't think, to boost the deck out of Rogue category. I'm even going to put it towards, like, lower Rogue. Honestly, I feel like Dark Magician decks don't really have a whole lot going for them, aside from, like, Eternal Soul and being able to play a Branded Engine and Skill Drain, and that's kind of it. That's kind of, like, what a lot of the more lower rogue decks are about, honestly. It's like they either mesh with another powerful engine or rely on floodgates in order to more or less keep their head above water, which, you know, I'm not bashing Dark Magician. I think Dark Magician is as cool as the next person does, but it's just not, it's frankly just not a very competitive deck, or it's not as competitive of a deck as pretty much every other deck on this tier list, honestly. So Dark Magician is going to be down here in Rogue, and it's probably going to end up being the bottom of Rogue, to be totally honest. Alright, next up we have Punk, as represented by Deer Note here. Punk is one of those decks that I'm definitely going to see a lot more of here in the future, and I think you all are too, because it's been everywhere in Diamond, and it's going to, I think, continue to be just about everywhere on the ladder as well. Punk is really good not only as a pure deck, but also as an engine. Pretty much if your deck plays the Ishizu engine, it's probably also playing a Punk engine as well, but even as a pure deck, which is how we're evaluating Punk for this tier list, even as a pure deck, Punk has put up some pretty good results in terms of both hitting Diamond 1 and topping in tournaments. I had it in tier 3 last time, and I'm going to keep it in tier 3 this time. I'll keep it above the Ishizu pile decks. I could honestly see myself putting Punk in tier 2. I do think Punk is that good of a deck. I just think it's like not played quite enough to be in the tier 2. I think it needs a little bit more representation, but it could easily get that. Either way, I think Punk is going to be one of those decks that lives beyond its like recent, you know, support that came out and the hype surrounding it. I think it's going to continue to prove to be a tier 3, if not upper rogue deck at the very least, moving forward. It's one of those decks I really want to try. I just actually haven't gotten around to it yet. Speaking of decks I do want to try someday, just haven't gotten around to yet. Here we have Spyrals. I say ugh, not because I dislike Spyrals. In fact, like I said, I just recently want to try them. But, you know, Spyrals is one of those decks that I get really scared of whenever I play against, because I very often don't know when to disrupt their combo. And I know I should just look up a Spiral combo guide at some point instead of living in fear of them. But Spyral's got a pretty nice power boost with the release of Illusion of Chaos. The deck already liked using Magician's Souls. I say liked, it was very, very much needed for their plays. So the ability to search that out is a huge boost for Spyrals. This is another one of those decks where I could really see it at the bottom of tier 3. But I think that would be under like a more dedicated pilot. I think from an overall, just general meta standpoint, I'm going to put it next to Thunder Dragon and Upper Rogue. And I think it's actually pretty much the exact same power level as Thunder Dragon, where like a very, very strong rogue deck with someone who knows the deck very well, it can easily tangle with even tier 1 decks. But I think it does, like Thunder Dragon, have that caveat of in order to be consistently very successful, it needs a very, very good pilot. Okay, next up we have Dragon Link. Dragon Link, and again, it might be a little hard to tell, but I've got a little Yugioh in the corner, so it's going to be more specifically Ishizu Dragon Link. This is much like Ishizu Adamancipator. Those two decks being the big ones that were, frankly, already good before, just not really being played by anybody. And then the Ishizus came along and gave people a huge incentive to play the deck. Even more so than Adamancipator, Dragon Link really, really likes having its monsters milled and in the graveyard specifically. And even if you end up milling your field spells, which was a bit of a risk you took when playing Grass and Dragon Links before, now you can just use your shufflers to put them back in the deck, and you don't even really have to like be too careful about, you know, when do I play Grass, do I search my field spells before I resolve it, etc., etc. So as far as where it lies on the tier list, I definitely have less experience with Ishizu Dragon Link than like Ishizu Adamancipator, although I am definitely looking to play a lot more Ishizu Dragon Link. I think the deck is extremely fun, and I want to cover it at least one more time before the end of the season. But I'm definitely going to keep working on it for sure. I think it's about on par with Ishizu Adamancipator. If I'm being completely honest and setting my biases aside, it might even be a little bit stronger. But just because I have less experience with it, I'm a little less confident in saying that. I'm going to put it here. Also, the other thing too, right? Even if Ishizu Dragon Link is better than Ishizu Adamancipator, which I suspect it might be, I think more people are going to end up playing Ishizu Adamancipator, especially because we're in Duelist Cup season, and Adamancipator the last 2 times just gets really, really popular around Duelist Cup season, so I expect we'll see more of it moving forward. Actually, now that I think about it, I think Branded Despia might even be up here. It's these 3 decks, Ishizu Adamancipator, Ishizu Dragon Link, and just Branded Despia in general. I think these are all actually pretty much the exact same power level right here at upper tier 2, with Mathmech and Swordsoul Tindy only being a little bit below them in terms of power. I'll leave it like this, but again, like these 3 I think are about the same, and these 2 are only like a little less powerful. It's like barely weaker, I think. Okay, next we have Drytron. Drytron, actually, I should have thrown the Yugioh potentially in the corner of this one, because this is another deck that got boosted by Ishizu stuff. The Drytrons don't necessarily want to mill. I guess they actually don't mind milling because their stuff activates from Grave, but a lot of the synergy with Drytrons and Ishizus is due to the fact that they're all fairies. So that can also be another very helpful factor. I haven't really seen too many Drytrons running around, even post-Ishizu. I think I'm going to end up putting it somewhere in Rogue. Probably about on par with the Adagnister and Marinesis, but I'll put it a little bit above because unlike these other 2 decks, at least this got some new support. I would like to speak more to Drytron's power level, you know, post-Ishizu, but again, I just really haven't run into it, honestly, so couldn't tell you too much. It's really good in theory, you know, obviously it's a fairy, so the Ishizus rather are fairies, so they work with Orange Heralds. They can be discarded off of Heralds and, you know, Herald of the Perfection as well. That will allow them to get their mill effects. The Drytrons can activate from graveyard, so milling them in theory isn't bad. Yeah, I just, again, haven't run into it, so can't really speak personally to it. Let me take yet another sip of water here real quick. before we move on to Floowandereeze. So Floowandereeze, these little birds have been managing to stick through on tier 3 pretty consistently since the wind barrier statue got banned. Yeah, when the wind barrier statue was around, I think this deck was pretty easily tier 2. And yeah, it was a significant loss of power level, but not enough to keep Flow out of the format. And Flow is actually another one of those decks that's looking fairly future-proof in that it can make use of Dimension Shifter, and moving forward, especially when the tier limits come out, but even in this meta as well, any deck that can play Dimension Shifter really should be. Graveyard-based strategies are at an all-time high right now, and they're only going to get more popular, so Floowandereeze I'm going to put at the top of tier 3, but in the future, even though this deck isn't really getting any new support, I think due to the way that the meta will shift, I could easily see this being tier 2 in the very near future here. Endymion, just another, it's kind of like Marine Cyst at this stage, where it's like, I haven't really seen as many Endymion decks around. It's still a good deck and still more than capable of hitting Diamond 1, but it hasn't really had any new support since Beyond the Pendulum, and it's just kind of like slowly started to fall off a little bit since then. I will say that, kind of similar to Adamancipator, Endymion seems to be one of those decks that tends to get a little bit more popular around Duelist Cup season, so we might be seeing more of it. But Endymion, I'm going to put it down here again with like Marine Cyst and Adagnister. In the Rogue tier, still a solid deck, just not seeing a lot of play and just overall not really doing a whole lot. Alright, here we have Pure Sprite as represented by Gigantic Sprite. So Sprites, I haven't really played with in a little over a week now. I've been so busy with the Ishizu decks, but you know, despite Ishizu decks being the new shiny toy that everyone is flocking to, we're still seeing a lot of Sprite on ladder, and of course that is deserved because Sprite is still probably just the best archetype overall right now. Even in the wake of all this Ishizu stuff, the Sprite decks are definitely more consistent and can, you know, in turn put out a lot of really good results, especially over the course of, like, you know, laddering a bunch of games. So if you're looking to get to Diamond 1 or the upper levels of Duelist Cup very quickly, I think Sprite is probably still the way to go if you're not, like, particularly well versed in the Ishizu decks. So Pure Sprite in particular, I definitely think is tier 1 still, and we've actually started to see within Master Duel Meta's tier list, which I typically take with a grain of salt because it only really focuses on tournaments, but within Master Duel's tier list, I actually noticed that Pure Sprite recently passed Runic Sprite, which I suspected might happen after the Runic spells got semi-limited. To be fair though, Runic Sprite is also in a worse spot against the Ishizu decks than Pure Sprite, I think, because the Pure Sprite decks can load up on all these techs against Ishizu stuff, and you can play stuff like, you know, Gamma and Joel and Lockbird, potentially. Just, yeah, all these, like, meta-specific techs. Runic Sprite, on the other hand, very much has to run its own, like, engine. It does not have room to play a whole bunch of disruption without killing its own consistency. So, I think in this meta in particular, we're starting to see Pure Sprite become the better meta call over Runic Sprite. Even if I think Ishizu Adamancipator should be in tier 1, I think Pure Sprite is probably still just overall the better deck. Okay, next up we have Runic. This is pure quote-unquote Runic, more commonly and popularly known as like the stun variant, so think Runics with, you know it by this point. I don't need to tell you what this is. I could honestly see myself putting this in Rogue. That's really where I think this deck is in terms of its power level. I'm just not super impressed by it in this meta. There's like so much of a variety of things going on that, like, you know, there can be only one was really good against like Sprites and Mathmech because they use a lot of monsters of the same type, but these Ishizu decks can definitely get away with playing under there can only be one and still putting a game-ending board in play. Similarly, they can play oftentimes under skill drain as well because a lot of the effects of these Ishizu decks are graveyard and not field based. So due to its popularity though, as Floodgate decks are always going to be popular in some capacity, I'm going to put this at the bottom of tier 3. But I personally think that Stun Runic or Pure Runic, whatever you want to call it, is a rogue deck. I don't think it's it's even tiered at this point. Like I said, I'm just not impressed by its power level in this meta. I just don't think it's that great of a deck, to be frank. Alright, next we have Labyrinth. Labyrinth has pretty consistently put up rogue showings since its release, and I feel like I say the same thing about Labyrinth every time. It's a rogue deck now, it's a very good one, but look out for very good support in the relatively near future that will definitely boost Labyrinth, probably closer to Tier 3 rather, if not Tier 2 levels of playability. For the time being, I'm going to continue to put Labyrinth in Rogue, though, relatively high up in Rogue. It's not only a fairly popular deck, but also a fairly good one as well. Alright, and then as represented by Martha, we have Exo Sisters. Exo Sisters is much like Floowandereeze in that it's a Tier 3 deck right now, and I think I'll even put it above the Ishizu piles, honestly. It's a pretty good deck. It's a Tier 3 deck right now, but moving forward in the future, we'll definitely see it probably move up to Tier 2 due to the virtue of the fact that it can run Dimension Shifter. And actually, even beyond that, it's a very targeted, of course, graveyard hate-based deck in general, and graveyard strategies with the Ishizus and Tier Limits are currently at and will continue to be at an all-time high for the foreseeable future here in Master Duel. So, Exo Sisters, like I said, I'm very comfortable putting in Tier 3 right now, and I think moving forward, they could very easily become Tier 2. Next up, we have Adventure Phantom Knight, and again, in the corner, it's a little hard to tell, but we do have Yugioh here. Adventure Phantom Knight has seen a decent boost in play thanks to the Ishizu Millers. At this rate, most of you probably know how I feel about this deck in general. A lot of people, in fact, pretty much everybody just stopped playing it once Water Enchantress and Fusion Destiny both went to 1. A lot of people assumed that, like every other deck that used the DPE Adventure engine, that Adventure Phantom Knight was just no longer good. This is definitely not the case, because unlike all the other DPE Adventure decks, Adventure Phantom Knight can actually search both cards as part of its combo. It sends the Water Enchantress with the Cherubini, and then, of course, you can go into the Fusion Destiny with the Predaplant Ver Anaconda. The Adventure Phantom Knight deck was also in the very unique position that it can very easily set up a Scythe Lock with this as well. Despite that, nobody played the deck. It really was a matter of, like, I think power level wise, it's been Tier 3, like, pretty much literally this entire time. It's just nobody's been playing it. Now we have Fusion Destiny at 2, which is obviously a boost to the deck. And then, like I mentioned, the Ishizu Millers offer another solid boost to this, as it is a graveyard strategy. It's definitely still going to be in Rogue, though, even though, again, I think it's in Tier 3. If I had to place this deck, I'd probably put it right about here, maybe even a little bit above the Ishizu piles, but when factoring in representation and not just power level, I think it's going to be down here with Drytron in terms of, like, one of those decks that people are going to experiment with the Ishizu Millers, but probably forget about relatively quickly. But again, I do think, as always as ever, that this deck is criminally underrepresented and absolutely being slept on. Okay, what do we have next here? Sky Strikers is what we've got up next here. So Sky Strikers have fallen off a little bit in the wake of all this new support, but in terms of representation, and I guess power level a little bit too, Linkage, of course, gave the deck a huge boost in power level in addition to the second Gagari when those became a thing. But nowadays, you know, like I said, all this power creep is slowly pushing it a little bit out of the format. Before, you know, so we had Sky Striker at Tier 2. I still think it's a very solid Tier 3 deck. I'll put it right here, honestly. I think it's like the bottom of Tier 3. It's kind of like the opposite of Runic Stun, where I think Runic Stun is, in terms of power level, upper Rogue, but in terms of representation, lower Tier 3. Sky Strikers, I think in terms of power level, are lower Tier 3, but in terms of representation, are probably closer here to lower Rogue. But I will concede on both of these and just put them both at the bottom of Tier 3 here. But Sky Striker, I do think, is the better deck than Runic Stun here. Speaking of Rogue decks that have kind of, Tier 3/Rogue decks that have kind of fallen off, we've got Dinomorphia next. It's so funny. It's so funny. On the subreddit, I just remember everyone complaining so much about Rextra, and I'm just like, really? You're all complaining about... Like, I know Yu-Gi-Oh! Players will complain about literally any deck, but Dinomorphia? Fucking really? Alright, you know, I guess whatever helps you sleep at night. In any case, Dinomorphia is gonna be over here with, like, Endymion and Marines. This is just falling off. It's not bad by any means, but yeah, the rest of the meta has not only caught up to, but very much surpassed it, and on top of that, I think people just are not as into the deck as they were when Rexterm first came out. Alright, next up we have Runic Sprite as represented with Hugin with a little gigantic Sprite in the corner. I touched on this earlier, but this deck is starting to fall off in terms of both power level and representation a little bit right now, due to two major factors. One, of course, being the fact that Freezing Curses, Destruction, and what was the third one? Was it Slumber? Yeah, Slumber all got semi-limited. Of course, Runic Sprite got much less hurt by this than like Pure Sprite, or Pure Runic rather, because it relies a little bit less on the Runic engine naturally, but still was a consistency blow to the deck. On top of that, though, like I mentioned earlier, this deck just does not play very well against a lot of these Ishizu mill decks. Like, even your Runic spells, like, even that amount of disruption can not be enough a lot of the time. And on top of that, there's also the Shufflers. I didn't even mention this earlier. The Shufflers being able to so targetedly just wreck Runic Sprite by putting back the same three spells you target with Fountain, but then you don't get the draws because they weren't put back by Fountain. That's also a huge blow to Runic Sprite. I don't know. If you were to ask me what I personally think, because here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put Runic Sprite in Tier 1 because I do think it is still a Tier 1 deck. And I think that moving forward, a lot of people will still continue to use it with good success. Like, it's definitely not a bad deck. In terms of where I personally think the power level of these decks are, like, I think that these should be switched, and I would even maybe argue of doing something like this, right? Where we have, like, Branded Despia above Runic Sprite, and then these Ishizu variants in Tier 1 even above them. But I don't know if that's where the meta actually is, and I don't think that's where it's going to be in terms of representation. I think a lot of people are still going to fall back on Runic Sprite, just because, you know, they've already been playing it, they already have it, and it's still a very good deck. So I'm going to keep it in Tier 1, but I really think that these four decks, Runic Sprite, Ishizu Adamancipator, Ishizu Dragon Link, and Branded Despia. Branded Despia, I think, is a little bit below the other three. Like, this I do think is solidly Tier 2, but these three decks, like I said earlier, I could just see shuffling them around between Tier 1 and 2 and that being right. And again, I personally think the power level of these decks is more like here, but in terms of representation and overall power level, and trying to remain relatively unbiased, I think we're closer to somewhere like here. Alright, next up we have... Oh, we have Dragon Link. I don't think I actually meant to keep this one in. Yeah, no, this is pure Dragon Link without Ishizus. I guess if you're going to use this without Ishizus, it'd probably be somewhere down here in Rogue, maybe like around, I don't know, here, but this was a mistake. I did not mean to leave this extra Dragon Link in. Salamangreat is the next one. I mentioned this in the last video that... or the last tier list video, rather, that Salamangreat is unfortunately fallen off. Even with the Mathmech support, it's just not good enough, and I think that is still the case. I'm going to put it down here. I'll even put it... I don't know. I mean, it's about on par with Dark Magician, right? I just don't think much of Dark Magician decks. I know it's a pet favorite because nostalgia, I get it, but I kind of think this Dark Magician decks are just not good at all, even a little, so that's not fair to say. Like I said, anything on this list, very much including Dark Magician, can hit Diamond 1 with a dedicated pilot. I personally don't think much of the deck, I guess, but it'll be down here with Salamangreat. Salamangreat's being a deck I'm a little more up on, the deck I like to play, but it's just not strong. I'll just admit it's not strong. Heroes are a stalwart force in the meta. They have, much like Thunder Dragon, been a staying rogue deck. It's been pretty consistently around. There hasn't really been a season where you don't see a hero deck every now and then. It's always been rogue, and I think it's always going to continue to be rogue at this point. I'll put it down here next to like Drytron and Adamancipator. It's honestly been about in the same power level the whole time, really, Heroes, which is kind of a testament to how... I was going to say how good the deck is, but really how much support it has and gets. Heroes did get that new wave of support with like the Neo stuff, but I don't know. It's like, it's not bad. Like, Neo's cards are not bad by any means, but like, it's still not better than like Plasma plus Dark Law plus Dark Angel on your opponent's board. That's generally going to be the best kind of hero end board that you can go for, and I think what hero decks in general are going to continue to strive for, even with all the new Neos support out. Alright, just a few more decks left here. Next we have Rika. Rika's in a weird spot. It's one of those decks where it's like, it's not bad by any means, but I think the reason it gets played as much as it does is because it did well recently in the TCG. As far as like actually being in the Master Duel meta in its place, it's definitely a rogue deck. Like, I don't know, it's not bad. I'm just not very up on it. I just don't think it does enough, honestly. I've thought about building it and trying it out, but just, I don't know. The videos I've watched on it and the times I've played against it, I just haven't been particularly impressed by the deck. Like I said, not bad by any means. I'll put it... I mean, I'll put it up here. I'll even put it above Labyrinth, honestly. It's definitely an upper rogue deck. You could even make an argument it's a tier 3 deck, and I don't even necessarily think that's wrong. But I just don't think it's that great now, and it's not going to be any better moving forward, as far as I know anyway, so... we'll just keep it right here in upper rogue. Alright, next we have Tri-Brigade Sprite. I think I had this in tier 3 last time, but this deck has honestly very much fallen off in terms of like people playing it. It's not a bad deck, and as always, we need to remember that it's going to get a lot better in the future once Sprite Sprint comes out. Of all the Sprite variants, Tri-Sprite will definitely be the one that gets the biggest power boost from the release of that card. It's definitely fallen from tier 3 though. I'm going to put it at the top of Rogue, because I do think it's a better deck than like Thunder Dragon and Spyral in terms of its like power level, and I think more people are probably playing it than those decks, but yeah, unfortunately not quite a tier 3 deck. I say unfortunately because I really like Tri-Brigade. We all know that by this point, but yeah, I think that's a good spot for it. Twin Sprite is another one of those Sprite variants that seems to have fallen off a little bit. I had it at the bottom of tier 2 last time, mostly because I didn't know where to place it. Now I've played with and against the deck more, so I'm a little bit more comfortable gauging its power level. And I think the bottom of tier 2 was actually a good spot for it last time. It's where I also kind of want to put it this time, but I think in terms of representation, we've seen enough, like, fewer people have been playing it that I'm going to put it actually at the top of tier 3. Yeah, that's another, like, I mean, like a lot of these spots I've been talking about, it could easily fluctuate. I could easily see this being lower tier 2, but I'll just leave it here for the time being. I think that looks right to me. So, and then last up we have yet another Ishizu pile deck, this one being Zombies. Zombies haven't really ever been, I don't think I've ever featured Zombies on a tier list because while being a solid, grass deck, they just really weren't ever making a significant splash in the meta. Now with the Ishizu stuff, like, I've played with Ishizu Zombies, and I think this video will probably come out before I post that one, but I will make a video on Ishizu Zombies as well. The deck is super good. Like, even, like, I wasn't familiar with the zombie support. Like, I wasn't super familiar with it at all going in, but once I really started playing with the deck and just realizing, like, the kind of crazy boards you could end on, I found myself extremely impressed with its power, but I don't know, I don't really see too many people playing it. I'm going to put it right here with the Ishizu, like, Adventure Phantom Knight, because I think it's about on par as far as, like, maybe being slept on its power level, but also just, again, not that many people playing it. Excuse me. So, that is going to do it. Those are all of these decks here. Let me take a look over the list one last time and make sure I like the placement of everything. Once again, I think the major point that I could see myself changing on is these three decks right here. Runic, Sprite, Ishizu, Adamancipator, and Ishizu Dragon Link. I think really only with time we'll be able to see where these decks end up actually falling, but if I were being more subjective, I would change it to this, right? I would say that this is where I think the current meta is, personally. As far as where I think it'll shake out and where I think the overall opinion of the meta is, and in turn how these decks will be represented, I think it's going to be more closer to this. And I think even these Ishizu decks being the top of tier 2 might end up being a bit high, which I know is weird because I was just saying, like, oh, I think they should be like lower tier 1, but I just don't know if enough people are going to play them. Again, the people who like the Ishizu stuff are going to be torn between all the different variants, so I think all the different Ishizu variants are going to see lower representation than their power level would probably indicate. But otherwise, yeah, I really like where everything is at on this tier list. I think this is a pretty good meta in general, honestly. I was going to say this is a good tier list, like, as far as placement is what I meant, but I'm a huge fan of this meta. I've seen a lot of people in my comments very vocally say they're not, which was also the case when pile decks were a thing in the past, but I love pile decks. I will definitely continue to keep featuring them, and I will definitely continue to keep enjoying this metagame. So, yeah, I think that's going to about do it for this one. Definitely let me know in the comments below what you think of this tier list and where you would place certain decks on the tier list. But for the time being, let's just go ahead and move now to our outro. Alright everybody, thank you so much for watching all the way to the very end of the video like this. That means a whole lot to me. Not just personally, but it's also a great way of supporting the channel as well. If you're interested in supporting the channel in other means, you can of course feel free to comment and or subscribe right here on YouTube. I'm always looking to the comments section. You guys leave some pretty awesome feedback as far as like constructive criticism goes when it comes to deck building, gameplay, channel content, all that stuff. So feel free to leave your opinion down there. I will be sure to take a look at that there. And then subscribing is going to be the best way to get notifications of when these videos drop. That does happen every day, by the way, so if you're looking for daily Master Duel content, you've come to the right place. And there are more places where you can get some daily Master Duel content. If you check out the description below, follow the top link over to my Patreon page. There for just $5 a month, which is as much as you pay for a booster pack. You'll find a lot more value than a pack full of filler over there. We've got some previews for content upcoming here on the channel. We've got some exclusive games that are only posted over on Patreon over there. We've got some Q&As, and then you can also have your name featured in this lovely credit sequence where I thank all of the people who are helping contribute over there on Patreon. It's a huge support to the channel, and it really means a lot as well. So thank you everyone who is donating that is featured here on screen. And again, you know, it's not just a pure donation. You do get some more daily Master Duel content over there just for being a part of the Patreon. But I think that's about all the time that I have for today's video. Once again, I just want to thank you so very much for sticking all the way to the end of the video. Again, it just means a lot, as I do put a decent amount of work into getting these videos out every single day. But that's about all the time that I've got for now. So without further ado, this is Hexlex. I'm signing out, and I hope you have a fantastic day.